I'm Emma Rutherford, and for most of my life, being the family's black sheep felt less like a label and more like a full-time job. My parents have a rhythm: college degrees, corner offices, weekend golf, perfectly ironed pride. I learned early that I marched to a different drum, one that liked secondhand bookstores, late-night pottery classes, and taking detours just to see what was around the next bend. My siblings fit into their suits and jobs like they'd been stitched for them. I fitted myself out of thrift store fabric and stubbornness. I met Adrian Mackey when I was 27 and stubborn enough to think secure could be negotiable. He had a laugh that made the ceiling grow taller and a head full of blueprints and impossible plans. People in my family saw him and shrugged. Nice enough, bit of a dreamer. Those were gentle insults masquerading as opinions. I didn't hear them the way they were handed out. I heard possibility. We eloped on a Tuesday because we wanted the whole world to slow down long enough for us to say yes without an audience. I took his name because it felt like choosing a new language, not running away, but choosing the part of my life that wasn't defined by other people's expectations. We've been married 3 years. We live in a cluttered apartment that smells of coffee and sawdust, where Adrian keeps a sketchbook like a talisman and plants that I have somehow not killed yet. We argue about paint colors and politics, make up over bad takeout, and pay our bills on time, thanks to a small growing of contracts Adrian brought home that nobody in my family ever bothered to ask about. We are not the ragged romantics they think we are. We are artisans of our own quiet success. I haven't seen them in a few years. Distance was mutual. Theirs by implication, mine sometimes convenience. There were sentences that hung between us, unspoken but obvious. You did this wrong. You didn't do what we expected. You chose poorly. Those sentences calcified into a wall I learned to live next to, like a landmark, part of the view, not the whole vista. Then, on an ordinary rainy Thursday, the mail arrived, and everything that felt ordinary tilted. It was a thick envelope, the kind that announces formality with cheap officiousness. My name was written in my mother's hand, the loops exactly as they were when I was 10, and she was still prone to including little hearts in her letters. Inside, on heavy cream paper, was an invitation to my youngest sister Jessie's wedding. Jessie. I blinked at the name until the letters steadied. The invitation was effusive in that particular family way. Florid sentences about joy and family, RSVP details, a dress code that might as well have been a personality test. There was an expectation threaded through the wording, not a question so much as a demand. Will you show up the way we want you to? Standing in my kitchen with that envelope in my hand, I felt something shift. Anger, maybe, flickered. Nostalgia, a little. A small, stubborn ember of hope, the sort of thing that's been polite enough to simmer under my ribs for years, lifted its head and asked, quietly, "Do you want to go?" It's funny how a single piece of paper can make you inventory your life. What would it mean to walk back into that hall? To see faces that have kept me at arm's length, to be judged again for the choices that have made me who I am? What would it mean for me to go? Not as someone hoping for approval, but as someone who knows her worth. I folded the invitation along its crease and put it on the counter beside the mug with Adrian's name on it. The question wasn't only whether I would attend Jessie's wedding, it was whether I was ready to let the past have the final word about who I'd become. We decided to go. Adrian folded the invitation into the pocket of his jacket like it was a talisman and kissed the back of my hand the morning we left. He didn't make a big production of promises. That's not his style. Just a squeeze and a look that said, "I'll be where you need me." He wore a navy suit that fit like it was made for him. I wore a dress that felt like armor. We drove out to the venue, a sprawling, old-world hall that tried very hard to be both majestic and discreet. Marble floors that echoed, velvet drapes, chandeliers that pretended not to notice how much light they threw. There were flowers arranged like small jealous gardens, and a valet who tapped his watch as if we'd arrived late to someone else's life. Seeing my family again felt like stepping into a painting I'd once admired from the other side of a glass. They moved through the room as if the space belonged to them by bloodstream. My mother, Martha, in a linen suit that smelled faintly of lemon oil, My father, Richard, with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to giving firm handshakes. Shane, who wore his rented penthouse like a calling card. And the rest, all the practiced little proud gestures that made the whole group look like a single gleaming organism. Jessie buzzed around, luminous and nervous and impossibly young in the way people at weddings always manage to be. The initial pleasantries landed like polite, measured pebbles. "Emma, you look different," my aunt said with the kind of surprise that doubles as judgment. "Where did you get that dress? It's very surprising." My uncle made a joke about how Adrian must have lost a bet to afford his jacket. There was that old family cadence, compliment folded into critique, curiosity folded into condescension, and I felt it in my teeth like something gritty. At the rehearsal dinner, the engine warmed up. The table was long and lacquered. The centerpiece of crystal and candlelight turned every face into an object under inspection. My family launched into the proud sort of stories families tell to value one another. Property deals, promotions, board positions, where they had been invited to speak. Shane told a story about installing an art collection in his penthouse and how his building's doorman now knew him by name. My mother mentioned offhand that she liked to support local charities and how fulfilling it was to make targeted donations. Each anecdote was a subtle tap. Look where we are, look where you aren't. Between those stories came the knives. Adrian always seemed like a nice enough dreamer, my father said, the word dreamer a currency of dismissal. I mean, nice, but you know how it is. Not everyone wants to take on the real world. My cousin laughed and added, "It's cute that you two manage. Must be nice to have fanciful hobbies and still somehow get by." There was the casual assumption that we were scrappy in the way of people who scrape by, not of people who build. Someone else murmured that if only they'd had our inclination for risk, they might have done different things, as if risk were a fashion accessory you could put on with the right attitude. They were generous with their pity and stingy with curiosity. They asked about our apartment like it was a charmingly cramped adventure, not a home. They asked Adrian where he worked, and when he shrugged and said he ran his own projects, the tone shifted to something that might have once been polite interest and had hardened into the expectation of failure. "Oh, like contracting?" Shane said, the word small and precise. "We always figured you'd end up handy." The laugh that followed was the kind designed to fold you in half. Adrian didn't snap back. He smiled the way someone smiles when he's cataloging the room for future use. Not cold, not proud, just quiet and present. I could see his jaw working behind that smile, and it made my blood move differently. Each barb felt like a match to a pile of dry tinder I'd been carrying for years, but I didn't light it. I sat through toasts that wrapped achievement around themselves like a banner and felt something calibrate in me. Not anger so much as a tightness, like a string pulled taut. By the time dessert arrived, a civilized sphere of chocolate and citrus that threatened to melt under the heat of conversation, my face hurt from smiling. I'd been cataloging their lines, the assumptions, the jokes, the way they measured people by bank accounts and zip codes. Every offhand comment piled on the small, persistent truth I'd been living. They had decided who we were without asking. And there, under the chandelier's careful light, I felt the ember in my chest that had been fed by years of their expectations. It glowed. I forced it down and took a long, steadying breath. I didn't blow up. I didn't storm out. I kept my voice level and my hands still. But when the conversation swerved into another round of condescension toward Adrian's dreamy ways, something quiet and sharp settled in my throat. I knew I was at the end of my patience. I also knew that whatever I said next had to be precise, not performative. I could feel the room tilt toward a familiar moral geography, their moral high ground, and I decided, then and there, that I would not let them stand on it unchallenged. I stood up slowly, set my fork down, and let the clink against the plate do the polite thing of asking for attention. The room obliged. There was rustle of napkins, a chair scraped, and Shane's laugh, the kind that expects someone to topple into embarrassment and give him the comfort of superiority. "My turn," I said, and I kept my voice steady. I didn't flash a grin or throw a look. I simply looked at every face at that table like I was reading off a list of facts. You all have been telling me for years that Adrian is a dreamer, that he's not practical, that we wouldn't make it. So maybe it's fair you know the whole story. Martha's smile faltered. Richard's hand went still on his wine glass. Adrian's expression never left that quiet, small smile he gets when something is unfolding exactly as it should. You remember the venue? I asked. Eyes turned to the chandeliers, the marble, the way the light slid across the banquet hall like it belonged to someone else. It's owned by Adrian Mackey's company. 3 different voices tried to speak at once. A scoff, a question, a choking laugh. I let them land. The penthouse Shane brags about? I continued. He's been paying a lease to one of Adrian's subsidiaries for the past year. I watched the color drain from Shane, like someone had turned down the saturation on him. He opened his mouth to say something sharp and found nothing. And the catering, I said. The company that's been recommending the menu, the one that did the tasting and got Jesse so excited about the hors d'oeuvres? That's run by people who work directly for Adrian. You could hear the air in a new way then. Not loud, just new. Conversations that had been looping like background music cut out, replaced by the tight silence that follows a dropped glass. My father made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been panic. Someone's fork clattered. My mother's hand clutched her napkin so hard the edge crumpled. I could feel their surprise like weather. It was pleasant, in the way sunlight is pleasant when it catches you unexpectedly. But I didn't savor their discomfort. I laid out facts, simple and unadorned, because the smallest knife can do the most damage when it's a single, clean statement. You called him a dreamer, I said. You called him handy. You said he didn't have a plan. But he buys properties, Shane. He negotiated the lease in your name, he sourced the caterer you rave about, and he built a business where other people see chaos and call it not realistic. You assumed and you judged. That's not the same as knowing. My aunt's mouth pressed into a line. Jesse, who at 22 had been the bright center of the night 2 hours before, sat very still, like someone hearing the bones of a house shift. Adrian reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it until my knuckles hurt just a touch. The contact anchored the room for me like a magnet. Shane's face went through a few frames. Denial, shame, anger, then the small, thin smile people use to hide being caught. That's absurd, he said at last. His voice was too loud in the silence. You can't mean that. I do, I said. And I mean that you decided what my life looked like from a distance. You decided Adrian's worth the way some people decide whether a painting is good by glancing at the frame. You never bothered to look closely. There were gasps, some indignant, some embarrassed. My father's jaw worked like a man trying to adjust to a new time zone. My mother's face went wet with a kind of immediate, bright regret that can't quite be labeled apology. The words tumbled out of her then, small, scattered apologies that sounded like someone whispering into a storm. We didn't know, she kept saying. We didn't mean. I let her. I let them all tumble for a while because truth has a way of making people trip. Revenge, in my head, never looked like vindictive fireworks. It looked like recalibration, turning the beam so everyone had to see what had been there all along. Adrian didn't gloat. He didn't lay out spreadsheets or parade contracts. He gave them what he'd given me for years, presence and calm. Later, standing in the echo of what I'd said, I realized the real cleverness wasn't that he'd owned things they admired. It was that he'd built quietly, without the soundtrack of self-importance. The people who cared most about appearances never bothered to ask what was behind the curtain. They assumed the curtain itself was the show. For a moment, the room was full of breaths being held and released. Some faces flamed with ash-pale shame, others hardened into defensive sets. I felt a lightness that wasn't triumph so much as relief. The truth was out, and it had a way of settling the ledger between us without theatrics. When my father finally spoke, it was small and rough around the edges. Emma, he said, and the name sounded like an old key trying a new lock. We were wrong. That was the sound of consequences landing. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't an execution, and it was a door opening that had been stuck for years, and the sunlight pouring in showed every speck of dust. I didn't take a victory lap. I only sat down, folded my hands, and let the room catch up. That night after the dinner, the hall emptied, but the air stayed full of things that needed saying. Guests drifted away in pairs and small, glossy groups. The chandeliers kept polishing themselves in silence. Adrian and I slipped out to the terrace, where the city smelled like rain on stone and the lights looked careless and kind. He wrapped his coat around my shoulders even though I hadn't said I was cold, and for a moment the world narrowed to the two of us and a hush that felt like forgiveness in progress. Not the ready kind, but the work in progress kind. "You did it differently," Adrian said. Not as praise exactly, more like fact. His voice was soft, like he was naming constellations. "You didn't humiliate them. You didn't gloat. That was harder and better." I let myself laugh, the one that loosened something in my chest. I almost wanted to throw a pie at Shane, I admitted. He squeezed my hand. "Almost is fine. You chose the version of revenge that makes you better, not bitter. That takes strength." We sat there a long time, arms wrapped and people's muffled footsteps below. Eventually, my parents found us. Or maybe the opposite. People in shoes like my mother's always know where to find their children. They came with small, shaking faces and voices that carried apologies like fragile dishes. My mother's words came first, halting and true. "Emma, we were cruel. We assumed. We judged. We are so sorry." My father's apology followed. It was awkward and fumbling and all the more human for it. I listened. I could see the shame settling on Shane like a coat he hadn't wanted to wear. I watched Jessie dab at her eyes with the corner of a napkin, bewildered and grateful and unsure how weddings suddenly felt like confessions. I didn't accept everything they said like it was cash. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not a switch you flip for other people's convenience. It's a choice you make for your own peace. So I sat there and let the apology arrive and be as messy as it was. When my mother reached out, her hand trembling, I did something that surprised me. I took it. Not because I forgave everything in that instant, but because I wanted to build a bridge that wasn't a surrender. Adrian watched me with that steady patience he keeps for the long game. Later, as we walked back inside past the chandeliers that finally looked less like judges and more like ornaments, he said something that landed me solidly in myself. "You don't have to forgive to accept a door," he told me. "You can leave it closed. Or you can open it a crack and see what happens. Either way, the choice is yours." The next morning felt softer than I expected, like the world had exhaled and given us room to be complicated. We returned for the wedding with a different posture. My family approached in pieces. My mother with quiet questions about our life together. Shane with an awkward offer to help with something small. Jessie with a grin that had not yet decided if the world was catastrophe or miracle. They apologized again, more plainly, and this time the apologies settled between sentences rather than formality. There were tears, of course. My father's apology came with a story I hadn't expected. A lonely lunch years ago where he realized he'd been living insurance policies instead of conversations. He said it clumsily, like someone trying to put a map into words. We cried not because that fixed everything, but because grief and recognition sometimes look the same. A breaking open that makes room for something like repair. I told them I wasn't going to pretend the past hadn't been sharp. I told them they'd have to ask, to listen, to prove that they'd learned. They said they would. Whether they mean it fully will be visible later in small things. Phone calls, visits, a willingness to ask about Adrian instead of assuming. That's the bargain I set. Quiet, but firm. And they took it because they wanted me there. When Jessie walked down the aisle, radiant and blindingly herself, I felt an odd, clean sort of pride. I had chosen to be present for the person she is, not for the drama of how we got there. I watched her say yes, and in that moment, the little ledger of who was right and who was wrong seemed less important than the fact that we were still a family in progress. We left the hall with our arms full of cake boxes and our hands knotted together. The apology had not erased years of small cruelties, and it didn't need to. What mattered was the decision I made in that terrace light. To stay, to let the possibility of mending be an action rather than a performance. That choice was mine, and it felt like power. Adrian drove us home, and as the city blurred past, I folded the night up and tucked it into my pocket like a map. I could already see the routes I would not take again. Silence as default, letting other people name my worth. I could see the new routes, too. Honesty, boundaries, the stubborn practice of letting people earn their way back in. The world didn't change overnight. No miracle deposit appeared in a bank account of trust. But the ledger shifted. I had stood up, not to demolish, but to make room for truth. And as the first quiet morning light poured through our apartment window, I felt something steadier than triumph. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you chose yourself without closing the door on others. That, I decided, was the kind of revenge I could live with. It left me whole and ready for whatever came next.